Okay, hello. Um, my name is Kjetil Manheim, and I've been asked by, how to pronounce this, George Pizarro Pardo, the professor, to say a few words to you about how we Norwegians, or at least I, think about the legacy of Viking inheritance and culture. And first of all, I will try to make it brief. So if I'm speaking too much, I've probably been cut out by Pardo. Another thing is that I'm not schooled in the topic. I don't have any degree in this. I'm just a Norwegian that are answering some questions. Okay, the first one I was asked to answer is, what archaeological remains are there of the Norwegian past in Viking? Quite a few, actually. It's not that we have buildings and such, because everyone used wood for the building mostly back then, not so much stone. We can see some remains around the country for where longhouses has been standing and so forth, but there's no actually building from the early and mid Viking area. What we do see is, of course, a lot of tumuluses around, grave places where they buried their kings and queens and what have you, rich people. I guess there was more kings and rich people than what people actually think it was. It wasn't like Norway was one kingdom, at least not in the early Viking Age. There were kings all around Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and Russia, of course. So what we do see a lot of is these grave places. We also find lots of coins and swords and stuff like that around the country. When they do find things like that of significance, they try to dig around to see if they can find more. But we have quite a few artifacts, everyday things like pottery and jewelry and weapons and stuff like that. So you can go to museums in Norway and you can see things from that area. In the late Viking area, if you can call it that, we have some stave churches, wood churches that are quite famous in Europe. They have this special architecture that was special for the Vikings in Norway. You can still see a few of them. They actually now, they are like 800, 900 years old now. So, but of course they were built after the Christianity came to Norway. Okay, the second question was that, let's see, what cultural aspects of Viking society are still present in you as a country? And that's a very difficult question to answer. Norway has been Christian since, 1,000 years. So, and of course we've been a part of Europe and the world as such. But if there's some legacy, I think there's equality, a culture where we are equal and try to solve things in the Norwegian word for it is ting, but it's more like a parliament, but it's not elected parliament. In the old days it was people gathering and putting their cases forth, and decisions was made by the free men. I have to say free men because in the Viking Age there were not so free women, even though you would believe it, but they didn't. It was the men, it was a patriarchic society. And free because they did have slaves, but you could become free. A slave was is nothing. I guess maybe it was much the same in Europe and the world where a slave could be. get paid free, but I don't know. But equality is something that's pretty much a part of the Nordic society. Equality, which has ended up in the social democracies that we see that the Nordic countries has today. I think that's part of the legacy. I'm not sure how big part it is, because I'm not schooled in these kinds of stuff, but I guess it is. And of course, we still like a good drink, but that's not unique for Norwegians and Swedes and Danes. But that was a part of the culture. We still celebrate winter solstice. No, well. Like the English word here, but the turn of the sun in the winter and the turn of the sun in the summer. So we still have culture events. It's of course known as Christmas all over the world, and of course in Norway it's now reckoned as a Christian celebration. But we still call it Yule, which is the old pagan way. And we still celebrate it by eating a lot and drinking a lot and giving each other presents, like as we did back in the Viking days. So that's survived, and I guess if you look closely, you'll find many things that's stuck with the culture. So, and the third question was, how do you personally feel about the eruption of Christianity in Viking society? And being who I am, I've always been a skeptic about religious organizations. I think religion is poison, it's a delusion. It's a collective delusion. The Vikings had their religions, of course. It's well known with Thor and Odin and all the known gods. It was something that we had it in the German culture, so you can find the same thing in the north of Europe. Christianity in Norway was pretty much enforced by violence, and it wasn't something that's people subjected to freely. We have a history which is pretty bloody around it, and the old ways and old gods lived in many years after the Christianity started to be, the main religion and only allowed religion. Still, people kept their old habits and their old religion alive. But I personally feel that it was a tragedy. I would like to have a society that wasn't, corrupted by the morality and the strange view of society and equality that Christianity has. I acknowledge that Christianity has developed into, different ways, but back then it was not something good. There's plenty of documented transactions in law, for instance, which the Christians enforced strong limitations on freedom that people had before Christianity. So in my perspective, I find that the Christianity was not a good thing for the Norwegian society or the Viking culture. That said, we don't know what the Viking culture would have ended up with, so it's a very difficult question to actually answer. But if you ask me personally, I think it was a tragedy. Norway still celebrates the violent takeover. Every year, the church and the state celebrate the life and death of King Olaf, which was one of the he was one that by violence, like you see IS today, enforce Islam in their areas. He enforced Christianity in Norway, and he did it by slaughtering families and threatening people if you didn't convert. So it's strange to see that they still celebrate it, but that's life, isn't it? Okay. Fourth special. Now I'm starting talking Norwegian. Fourth question. What is the main contribution of the Nordic Viking civilization to the current world and universal history? Well, I don't know. At least it has given us a lot of legends, a lot of good stories. I think the culture around trade and seamanship was probably something that the Vikings was a big part of. The Vikings, the empire of the Vikings was, if you could call it an empire, wasn't one king, but the area they held at some point was quite large. They established what we know today as Dublin. They established Moscow. They had Greenland and Iceland and all the North Atlantic. They took most of UK, what is today United Kingdom, and so forth. But it was a different time. So I guess Viking culture has become a part of Western European culture at least, but also Eastern, if you think of Moscow and Russia. So, but what exactly, I don't know. I would think that we contributed with the idea of equality, that all men, all free men are equal, but that was not unique for Vikings, so it's difficult to say. They did do trade though, so they traded way beyond Istanbul or Miklagard, which was the word, the name for the city, in the Viking Age, and they went all the way to what we know is North America today. We know they set up settlements in Greenland and everywhere, so in the north. So I guess what we see today is remains of that. I think the Viking culture blended into the rest of Europe, and it's just that Vikings were, had a special history with violence and the ships and the horror. But Viking culture was much more. It was most people in the Nordics weren't traveling around the world conquering. And plundering and raping. That wasn't the culture. Of course, it's a part of the history, but it's not the culture of the Norwegian people or the Danish or Swedish. So I think there's much more to it, and that brings me to question number 5, which is: do you think Norwegian society currently values this legacy? Or has it fallen into oblivion? And of course, a lot of things has fallen into oblivion. Which part I don't know, because they're gone. But I do think there's, in recent times, there's been much more sober history telling around the Viking culture. Not so much about the plundering and the spectacular stuff. Not so much the myth around Thor and Odin and all the religion beliefs. I think there's more complex history telling at the moment that explains more how Europe and the Western culture of Europe developed and the Vikings' role in that. The Vikings ended up being kings in France and in UK, in Russia, and so forth. So of course it's a big part of everything. It seems that Norway is proud about their legacy, but as the rest of the world, there's not that much history around the Viking Age that goes beyond the actual impact that the Viking culture had on the rest of Europe while going out and plundering stuff. But there's a lot of history that is now being put together. There's a lot of books that are being now more available from the area, the time period, I mean. So it's much easier for us Norwegians to actually learn more about that time, that period of our culture. I think Norway is doing a pretty good job. But still you can see in Norway that they show Vikings in this what you can call you see them portrayed as people tend to think they were, with helmets, with horns, and aggressive people. But it really was just a culture which expanded and which did trade and everything like anyone else. Okay, so finally, number 6. What value of the Viking world do you highlight more? What would you advise to follow my students? Okay, so I don't know actually, but if I'm with you and you were interested in the European culture, it goes from the south to the north to everywhere in Europe, from the Celts and the Vikings and what have you. I would say that I would go into the old books, the stories that you can find in the different libraries, which now is partly online, and look into the society. It's surprising how modern it is when you look at it. It's like the people that write these stories, they could easily have been living today. So it's interesting to go in and see the story from their perspective and try to understand why things ended up as it did. I think the part that has with equality, free men, things like that, I think that's a very important part of the Viking legacy. It is a part of how we in the North is running our society today. And if you're interested in how societies has been developed and political ideas has developed, I think you will find some interesting stuff there. So yeah, I think I would go there. And if you find that Vikings with helmet, horns, and what have you is funny, and all the drinking is fun, and you are interested more in the battles of Vikings, so there's plenty to take from, but it's not that interesting in my opinion. So I guess that concludes the questions. I hope I answered them all, and that you students find that this was at least entertaining, if not so so much information. So as I understand, you go at the Manuel de Salas school in Chile. You have a lot of history yourself, both from ancient and from the Europeans that came. So you have much more to speak about, I guess, as a culture than we have in Norway, who hasn't had these migrations that you have had. But I'm interested in your history as well, so it's mutual, I can assure you that. So cheers from Norway, and to you guys in Guanaqueros, is that correct? I hope so. And I hope your studying of the Viking is interesting and it doesn't bore you to death. Okay. So bye bye from Norway.